Imagine being 30,000 feet in the air. Your 6-year-old son crying softly in your arms because he's terrified and in pain from a brain tumor, when the woman in the seat in front of you whips round, glares at you like you're the worst parent on earth, and demands that you shut that child up immediately. That's exactly what happened to me on Flight 2847 from Seattle to Boston. And what happened next restored my faith in humanity. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare flight. My son Ethan had just been diagnosed with a pediatric brain tumor. 3 weeks earlier, a glioma pressing against his temporal lobe, and we were flying from Seattle Children's Hospital to Boston Children's Hospital for a specialized surgery that could save his life. My baby, my 6-year-old, who still believes in Santa Claus and wants to be an astronaut, was facing brain surgery, and the pressure from the tumor was causing him severe headaches, dizziness, and these episodes where he'd just cry because the pain was too much. We were in row 18, window seat, and Ethan was clutching his little stuffed dinosaur, staring out at the clouds. When the headache hit about 45 minutes into the flight, he started whimpering, then crying softly, saying, "Mommy, it hurts. It hurts so much." And I'm holding him, trying to comfort him, giving him his prescribed medication. When I hear this loud, exasperated sigh from the seat directly in front of us, this woman, I'll call her Karen, though her name was Patricia Vanderbilt, turns around in her seat so fast her designer scarf nearly flew off, and I get my first look at her, maybe late 40s, burgundy-dyed hair in this severe bob-cut, huge tortoise-shell glasses, wearing a bright coral blazer with gold buttons like she's going to a business meeting on a casual Tuesday flight. And she has this look on her face like my son's pain is personally ruining her day. She looks at Ethan, looks at me, and says in this sharp, loud voice, "Excuse me, but some of us are trying to rest. Can you please control your child?" I was so shocked I couldn't even respond immediately. Control my child. He's 6 years old with a brain tumor. But before I could say anything, she kept going. I paid good money for this seat, and I shouldn't have to listen to screaming for 5 hours. This is why parents shouldn't fly with children who can't behave. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to HOA Karen Tales for more wild Karen stories. My protective mama bear instinct kicked in, and I said as calmly as I could manage, "Ma'am, my son isn't misbehaving. He's in pain. He has a medical condition, and we're flying to Boston for emergency surgery." You'd think that would make any human being with a heart immediately apologize and back off, right? But Karen just rolled her eyes dramatically and said, "Oh, please. Every parent says their kid has some condition. I've heard it all. Just give him a tablet or something to shut him up." The passengers around us were starting to notice. People were looking over, and I could feel my face burning with anger and humiliation. But I was trying so hard to stay calm for Ethan's sake. I leaned forward slightly and said quietly but firmly, "My son has a brain tumor. He's 6 years old, and he's terrified and in pain. Please have some compassion." Karen's eyes narrowed behind those huge glasses, and she said in an even louder voice, "I don't care what excuse you're using. Control your brat. There are noise ordinances and rules about disrupting other passengers." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did this woman seriously just threaten to have me and my sick child removed from a flight to his life-saving surgery because his crying was inconvenient? Ethan heard her harsh tone and started crying harder, burying his face in my shoulder, his little body shaking, and he whimpered, "Mommy, am I being bad? I'm trying not to cry." My heart shattered into a million pieces. My baby was apologizing for having a brain tumor. I held him tighter and said, "No, sweetheart, you're not bad. You're so brave. Mommy's got you." And then I looked at Karen with tears in my eyes and said, "He's 6 years old with a tumor pressing on his brain. He has every right to cry. What he doesn't have is the ability to control pain that would make a grown adult scream. So if his suffering bothers you, maybe you're the one who needs to find some empathy." Karen's face turned red. Not embarrassed red, but furious red. And she stood up in the aisle, pointing her finger at me, and announced loudly enough for half the plane to hear, "This is why acceptable. I am a Platinum Rewards member, and I demand to speak to a flight attendant. This woman is being hostile, and her child is disturbing the peace. Someone needs to do something about this." That's when something beautiful started to happen. This older gentleman sitting across the aisle from us, maybe in his 60s, wearing a burgundy cardigan and glasses, looked at Karen and said in a calm but firm voice, "Ma'am, the only person disturbing the peace is you. This mother just told you her child has a brain tumor and you're complaining about noise. Have you no shame?" A young woman a few rows up turned around and I could see tears in her eyes, and she said, "I had childhood leukemia. I remember being that scared little kid. Leave them alone." Another passenger, a businessman in a suit, called out, "She said her son has a brain tumor. What part of that don't you understand?" Karen looked around, shocked that people were defending me instead of supporting her, and she sputtered, "You people don't understand. I have sensitive hearing. I have my own medical issues." But the older gentleman cut her off. "Your sensitive hearing is not more important than a child with a brain tumor getting to his surgery." "Ma'am," the flight attendant, a kind-faced woman with her hair in a neat bun, name tag reading Jessica, finally arrived at our row, and Karen immediately switched into victim mode. "Thank God you're here. This woman's child has been screaming non-stop, and she's being aggressive toward me when I politely asked her to quiet him down. I want them moved, or I want to be upgraded to first class as compensation for this nightmare." If you're enjoying this, hit that like button and share this video to support HOA Karen Tales. Jessica looked at me, looked at Ethan, still crying softly in my arms with his little bandage visible on his temple, looked at my medical supply bag clearly marked with hospital tags, and I could see the assessment happening in her professional eyes. She turned to Karen and said, "Ma'am, can you please return to your seat and I'll address this situation." But before Karen could respond, I pulled out Ethan's medical documentation from my bag. I'd learned to carry it everywhere after weeks of hospital visits. And I handed it to Jessica and said quietly, "My son has a pediatric glioma. We're flying to Boston Children's Hospital for emergency surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning. He's on pain medication, but the pressure changes from altitude make his symptoms worse. I'm so sorry if he's disturbing anyone. We're doing everything we can." Jessica looked at the documents, looked at Ethan with such compassion, and then she turned to Karen with an expression that had completely shifted from customer service politeness to protective authority. She said, in a clear voice that carried down the aisle, "Ma'am, this child has a documented medical condition and is traveling for emergency surgery. The airline makes accommodations for medical situations. If you're uncomfortable, we can see about moving your seat. But this family is not moving. Karen's mouth dropped open in shock. Are you serious? You're taking her side. I'm the one being harassed here. The older gentleman across the aisle spoke up again. You're the one doing the harassing, ma'am. The rest of us have no problem with a sick child who needs to get to his surgery. The young woman who'd mentioned her leukemia stood up and walked back to our row, looked at Ethan with tears streaming down her face, and said to me, I survived childhood cancer 20 years ago. Your son is so brave. And then she looked at Karen and said, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Want to hear the craziest HOA tales every week? Subscribe to HOA Karen Tales and never miss out. More passengers started speaking up. A mother with 2 kids of her own said, I would do anything to protect my children. This mama is a warrior. A man who identified himself as a pediatric nurse said, brain tumors in children cause excruciating pain. This child is actually being incredibly brave. A college student said, my little brother had brain surgery. I remember those flights. You're doing great. Karen looked around at what had become an entire plane full of people defending us. And you could see the realization dawning on her face that she'd miscalculated badly. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. This is discrimination. I'm being targeted because I spoke up about a legitimate complaint. I'm going to report all of you. Jessica, the flight attendant, had clearly reached her limit. She said in a voice that meant business, ma'am, you have 2 options. Return to your seat and cease harassing this family, or we can arrange for law enforcement to meet the aircraft upon landing in Boston for disrupting a flight and harassing passengers. Which would you prefer? The entire section of the plane went silent. You could hear the engine hum and nothing else. Everyone was watching Karen's face cycle through shock, anger, indignation, and finally the beginning of fear as she realized she'd bright red now. Her hands were shaking slightly as she clutched her designer handbag, and in a much quieter voice, I don't want to sit near this chaos anyway. Jessica nodded. We have a seat available in row 8. Please gather your belongings. As Karen started pulling her expensive luggage from the overhead bin, the businessman who'd spoken up earlier said loud enough for her to hear, some people have everything except compassion, and several passengers nodded in agreement. Karen moved forward to her new seat in complete silence, and the energy in our section immediately shifted from tense to supportive. The young cancer survivor, Emma, asked if she could sit in Karen's now empty seat so she could talk to Ethan. And when I said yes, she spent the next 20 minutes telling him about her childhood cancer journey, showing him her medical ID bracelet, and promising him that he was braver than he knew. The older gentleman, Mr. Rodriguez, it turned out, was a retired pediatric oncologist who'd flown this same route dozens of times with families just like ours. And he gave me his contact information and recommended additional specialists in Boston. A woman from a few rows back brought us extra snacks and a blanket for Ethan. Another passenger, who was a child life specialist, gave me coping techniques for the surgery prep. The businessman sent back a note with his email offering to help with any travel expenses we might face. The flight attendant, Jessica, checked on us every 30 minutes for the rest of the flight, brought Ethan a special kids meal, even though we hadn't ordered one, and gave him a pair of pilot wings that made him smile for the first time in hours. By the time we landed in Boston, Ethan had fallen asleep against my shoulder, exhausted but calmer, holding his dinosaur in one hand and those pilot wings in the other. As we were deplaning, I saw Karen rushing ahead, not making eye contact with anyone, and I heard one passenger say to another, "Imagine being so miserable that you'd attack a child with cancer." Jessica walked us all the way to the gate, helped us navigate to ground transportation, and before she left, she hugged me and said, "Your son is in our prayers. You're an amazing mother, and I'm so sorry you had to deal with that woman. But I'm glad you got to see that most people are good." We made it to Boston Children's Hospital that evening. Ethan had his surgery the next day, and I'm beyond grateful to say that the operation was successful. They removed 80% of the tumor, and he's been in remission now for 8 months. But here's the incredible part. Remember Emma, the cancer survivor who sat with us? She stayed in touch, and she actually visited Ethan during his recovery and became like an honorary big sister to him. Mr. Rodriguez, the retired oncologist, connected us with a support group that changed our lives. Several passengers from that flight sent cards to the hospital. One couple even sent a care package with toys and books for Ethan's recovery. Thanks for watching HOA Karen Tales, where every Karen story has a twist. Like, share, and subscribe for more drama from the neighborhood. As for Karen, I found out later from a friend who works for the airline that she'd actually filed a complaint about the flight, claiming she was verbally attacked by passengers and discriminated against by crew. But when the airline reviewed the incident reports from Jessica and multiple passenger statements, they not only denied her complaint, but suspended her platinum status for 6 months for harassment of medically vulnerable passengers. Sometimes karma doesn't just show up. It shows up with documentation and witness statements. The moral of this story: a child's life is always more important than your comfort. And when you attack someone who's already fighting the hardest battle of their life, don't be surprised when the whole world stands up to defend them. Ethan still talks about the plane where everyone was nice, and he keeps those pilot wings on his bedside table as a reminder that even in the scariest moments, there are more good people than bad. If you've ever witnessed someone defending a vulnerable person, or if you've been that defender yourself, share your story in the comments. We need more of that energy in the world. And to anyone going through something similar, you're not alone. Your child's tears are valid, and there are more people ready to stand with you than against you. Stay strong, stay compassionate, and remember that Karen may have spoken first, but the entire plane had the last word. I'll see you in the next story on HOA Karen Tales, where we prove that kindness always wins, even at 30,000 feet.